Okay, I think we should probably get started. I'm grateful for this friendly. So everyone can mute themselves.
Oh yeah, mute. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. I'm grateful for this this interlude of our friendly exchanges. It creates a little bit of community, I think. So we're grateful for that. So you know who I am. Most of you perhaps know who I am. I'm Pat Ferrone, and I'm going to do the welcome for you today. So I've actually written it out. So if my eyes stray from the screen, it's because I'm reading what I've written. Okay. So as a co-coordinator of Pax Christi, Massachusetts, along with Father Rocco Popolo, and on behalf of the board, I'm happy to welcome Johnny Zokovitch and friends and members of Pax Christi to our first virtual assembly.
How what do I do?
Okay, I think a couple of people are muted, so would you try that, please? Because we can hear the ambient noise from your location. It is not of our choosing to be distant from one another, but as we all know, the persistence of COVID has altered all the rules of engagement. So we are grateful that in these confounding times, there are ways to be present to one another, and consider that in a curious way, we are actually closer than if we were in a hall all gazing forward. So if you want to take a moment to run through the roster of photos that line your screen and smile your own welcome to others. We are physically apart, but be assured that we are connected. The theme for today's assembly, Resilience and Hope in a Time of Chaos, Pax Christi Engaged, hits the mark given the reality of our days. I don't need to go through a litany of ills that plague our world, but the truth is, piled on top of one another and granting no respite, we are often overwhelmed. So the question is, what boosts our resilience? What gives us hope as followers of the nonviolent Jesus? And how do we live in ways that energize one another to trust in the means and spirit of transformative love when we seem trapped in an atmosphere of rancor and division? Yesterday, on a gorgeous, sunny, though cool day, I spent time working and playing in the dirt of my large garden. Perhaps, like you, I've discovered ways in which my mind is sometimes released from the constraints of worry or gloomy rumination and becomes open to paying soft attention to what I'm actually doing in the moment, and is free also to absorb the sounds of nature and listen for the spirit's promptings. Tending the vegetable garden, or even dismantling and preparing it for another season, is my way. The final task of the morning was to free the wire fence from the tight tendrils of the broad beans that had climbed all the way to the top. As the plants grew, they wrapped their limbs around the sturdy segments of the frame, holding on for dear life. They crowded one another, perhaps for company. They reached for the sun and welcomed the rain, and when the warmth of the earth coaxed them, they flowered, then morphed into bright green, crunchy veggies. Picked, they became the gift that kept on giving, feeding us who gathered at table again and again. As I patiently cut and untwined the tendrils from the wire fence, I regarded the possibility of the sentience of the plant, their special awareness of the laws to which they must comply to burst their tight seed boundaries to become more than they imagined possible. They were patient while holding tightly to the support provided even in stormy weather. They no doubt crowded one another for fellowship and they sensed that in due time, something good would come of their trust. Perhaps in the example of the lowly bean, we who have accepted the vocation to become peacemakers will consider them as a metaphor. Thomas Merton says, "My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going." And yet he put his faith in God's way of love no matter what. So, like the bean, who maybe sensed a destiny without knowing how it would unfold, we can cling to Jesus' presence in the Spirit. We can engage with one another and accept others' love and nurturance. We can trust that in good time, our hope and love and work and resilience on behalf of the gospel of peace will bear fruit. So now let us begin our day with an opening prayer offered by Irene Descharnay, board member. Thank you. Irene, can you unmute yourself, please?
Prayer for Conscience and Courage in Times of Public Struggle by Joan Chittister. Loving God, lead us beyond ourselves to care and protect, to nourish and shape, to challenge and energize both the life and the world you have given us. God of light and God of darkness, God of conscience and God of courage, lead us through this time of spiritual confusion and public uncertainty. Lead us beyond fear, apathy, and defensiveness to new hope in you and to hearts full of faith. Give us the conscience it takes to comprehend what we're facing, to see what we are looking at, and to say what we see, so that others hearing us may also brave the pressure that comes with being out of public step. Give us the courage we need to confront those things that compromise our consciences or threaten our integrity. Give us, most of all, the courage to follow those before us who challenged wrong and changed it, whatever the cost to themselves.
Thank you, Irene. And now we'll go to Brian Ashmankis, a member of the Pax Christi board and the National Council as well, who'll do the introduction of Johnny Zokovitch, our guest today.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, as Pat said, I'm part of National Council. I've been on the last 3 years and been on the board for a while longer, and gotten to know Johnny, and so I just introduce him a bit, and I'll hand it over to him. So John, not too much surprise, but Johnny Zokovitch has been the executive director of Pax Christi for just over a year. And in this capacity, he has hired an extraordinarily talented and diverse national staff. He's developed and begun to implement an ambitious vision and acted powerfully and repeatedly in favor of a more just, peaceful, and nonviolent world. All while, as we know, responding gracefully and proactively to some of the greatest crises of a generation, of a global pandemic, an increasingly authoritarian president, and a serious reckoning with our nation's long legacy of racism. I had the opportunity to serve on the search committee for Johnny, and that not for Johnny, but that recommended Johnny to be the next executive director. And I remember he stood out as someone who really knows how to build a movement. He had an amazing vision for the future organization, and especially who deeply loves Pax Christi and its members. Johnny's been involved with Pax Christi for almost 30 years and has served in a number of roles locally, nationally, and internationally. And something that particularly strikes me about him, he's one who both values the wisdom and commitment of our older members, and he encourages and empowers our younger ones to become more involved. I've also had the pleasure to work closely with Johnny during this past year as the treasurer of the National Council, and to get to know him personally when I lived in Washington, D.C., where my seminary actually shared a building with the national office. I've always found him both be an inspiring leader, able to encourage others to reach their greatest potential, and a good listener willing to support me and others as we struggle through our own lives and work for peace and justice. Both a colleague who brings numerous talents to a team, and a friend I can count on through thick and thin. And before I hand it over to Johnny, I'll just quickly go over for everyone how the question and answers will work. So Johnny will speak for about a half hour, and then we'll have questions, answers. And rather than us all kind of yelling out or raising our hands, the way we're going to make this work is use the chat function, and you'll message me, and then I'll kind of cycle through the questions and say this question's from so-and-so, and they hey, I might merge some questions if they're similar, but we'll work it. So basically, if everyone, at least for me, I'm one who learns by doing. So if you all want to go down to the bottom of your screen and open, there's a little speech bubble which is the chat function. You click on that, and it will open this thing on the side, a little bar on the side of the screen. And then the key here is at the bottom of that chat function, you'll see a little thing that says everyone. And that's basically, if you send a chat right now with that selected, you'll send it to the group. But instead, basically pick me, pick Brian Ishmankis. And when you set that, then the next chat you send will go just to me. And that's the best way to get, that way everyone's not seeing everyone's questions. You'll just send them all to me, and I'll go through them. So hopefully that makes sense. Not the end of the world if you accidentally send it to everyone or thing, and you can always, it doesn't make sense, but that should be, once Johnny's done, you can ask those questions, and then you can just basically enter in the chat, and you'll, yeah, I'll go from there. So hopefully that made sense. Is there any quick, I mean, you can even unmute or say something if any of that didn't make sense, or there's something lost there, but okay. I'd say you can privately message me if anything comes up during it, but if you haven't figured it out, then yeah. Anyway, but anyway, without further ado, I'm just gonna hand it over to Johnny. Yeah, I'll hand it over to Johnny, and he'll take it from here.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. And thanks, Pax Christi, Massachusetts. It's good to be with you guys. Brian, thanks so much for that introduction. You guys, Brian has been such a gift to Pax Christi USA, having him on our national council, and especially to me personally, his leadership, his compassion, but also his patience as I've learned, to embrace this new position that I found myself in. It's just been a great gift to me. And really, overall, Brian's a real gift to the movement. I also wanted to say a quick thank you to Rocco and Pat for putting this all together and for getting it coordinated. It's such a strange time. And for me too, I want you guys to know, it's strange for me talking over Zoom, because often when I talk to groups, I have a little bit of a kinetic personality, and I like to move around, and I like to be up on my feet, and I like to sing, and I like to get involved. And it's so weird to sit and have to be in front of a screen and stay in the frame and everything. But I'm going to do my best. I'm going to do my very best to get this done. I also want to say thank you to Irene for starting us off. That was a really beautiful prayer. And as I'm sure folks are aware, Joan Chittister has been a longtime supporter and member of Pax Christi USA. And really, in many ways, we have the Erie Benedictines, the community that she's a part of, to thank for their sort of, nurturing of our movement for such a long time. And so it was really nice to start this off hearing Irene's voice, hearing Joan's words. And I just want to say thanks for that. So, as Brian mentioned, I took the position of Pax Christi USA's executive director just over a year ago. And again, a big part of my plan was to spend a significant amount of time out on the road, meeting with Pax Christi local groups and regions, students and young adult groups, parishes, supporters all across the US. So, I'm grateful for the flexibility that this new technology allows us, including, especially how it allows us to be able to connect virtually. But I think there's somebody unmuted there who is, okay, I think we're good now. So again, I wanted to just say, I'm thankful for this new technology with Zoom and stuff, but there's really no substitute for being able to sit down at a table together, to break bread and to visit with one another in each other's homes, and being able to shake hands or to give a hug or just be there with the people who are part of our community, part of the Pax Christi family. The pandemic has changed those plans, but we'll take what we can get. And this chance to see the faces of so many of you with whom I've corresponded over email or who I've met at other events a long time ago. I mentioned Rocco and Pat. I see Mike Moran here, and Pax Christi USA Ambassador of Peace, Nancy Small, is with us. Sister Linda, who I have emailed with so often. Hey, Sister Linda. The Shanleys, who are great mentors to so many folks in this movement, and just really, prophets that have helped us to embody who Christ is in the world today. And I see Cornelia Sullivan and so many other folks. And so I'm just really grateful to be able to be here with you guys today. I also want to, before I get started, introduce you to one of our newest staff members, Lauren Bailey. If you scroll around, you'll see Lauren Bailey in one of these frames as well. Lauren is our new national field organizer, and she's going to be working with local groups, regions, and handling a lot of our outreach to students and young adults. She's only been with us for about 3 months now, but really, I'm just so thrilled in how she's already expanding our capacities and setting the important groundwork that we need for us to be able to grow this movement. So thanks, Lauren, for joining us. And I hope that many of you on the call get a chance to meet Lauren, and feel free to throw a question or two her way too, if you'd like. I don't know how long she can stay with us today, but I'm glad that she's able to be here at least for a little while. Secondly, I want to acknowledge a few things. As Pat mentioned, these are times of upheaval and chaos, when so many are suffering, when our nation is wrestling deeply on so many fronts, but especially with the sin of racism, and we're in the midst of a reckoning with our own nation's history. I think it's important to name our perspectives and to own the legacy that we've been given. So I want to say that I come to you today as a white man, and I want to acknowledge that my views and experiences have been shaped by the privilege that's accorded me because of my skin color. I'm joining you too from my home in the city of St. Louis, Missouri, a land that was once home to indigenous people like the Cahokia and the Osage and the tribes of the Illini Federation before they were dispossessed of this land by the French and the English and the Spanish. It's important for each of us to know the history that we're part of, for me to own my own racism, and to acknowledge how much work I have as a white person still to do. I carry with me, even as we talk today, an intimate awareness and a sorrow for how my city, how the towns and cities everywhere in the US bear the scars and the legacy of racism and colonization. So, our theme today is resilience and hope in a time of chaos, Pax Christi engaged. And I think the easy place to start is with the word chaos. So let's talk chaos for a second. One of the real kindnesses of being on staff at Pax Christi USA is how intimately and personally people care about you. Especially since this pandemic started, the emails and the cards and the phone calls from some of the people on this call all wanting to know how we are doing, how people at the national office, the staff, myself, how we're doing. It's really been amazing. And it drives home how being part of Pax Christi is like being part of a family. The concern that folks have shown in this moment of national chaos and the impact that it has had on our work is really, really touching. As someone who grew up in this movement, for a long time, I used to say it was like having 100 mothers all over the nation worried about you. Part of my response to folks has been to say that while the pandemic casts a tremendous shadow and has made us have to rethink not only what our work is, but how to do that work, there's a sense of familiarity, honestly, for me with this, starting this second stint at Pax Christi USA amidst a national crisis. I first came to the national staff in 2001, after a few years of being active in Pax Christi, Florida, running a group as a campus minister for many years at the University of Florida, and coordinating as a volunteer and invited into that role by Nancy Small, who's on this call today, some of Pax Christi USA's outreach to students and young adults. Dave Robinson had just been named the new executive director of Pax Christi, succeeding Nancy, and Dave offered me a part-time position on staff as a program associate. My start date was September 4th, 2001. I think some of you are probably doing the math right now, and yes, I started at Pax Christi USA exactly 1 week before 9/11. I was in Erie, where the national office used to be, and we had just spent 4 or 5 days of planning, setting the programs and priorities, mapping our events, creating resources, which would all guide our work for the next 12 to 16 months. I remember that we finished that plan. It ended up being a 25-page plan late on the night of September 10th, and we went to bed so pleased with everything that we had put together. That next morning, I was sitting in the conference room when another staff member came in and said to turn on the television, that a plane had just crashed into the World Trade Center. We watched it live, as so many of you must have, when that second plane crashed, and we started to hear the whispers of words like terrorism and retaliation and war. I remember Dave coming into the conference room, all of the staff gathered, and he picked up a printed out copy of that exhaustive plan that we had poured our hearts into day and night for the last 5 days and a half, and he just ripped it in half. Our world had just changed, and we were going to have to respond on the fly. I think some of you have probably heard the saying before, humans plan and God laughs. So, just over 4 months into my first year as executive director, and we had also just finished a plan. We had the National Council, Brian, approve it at their meeting in early February, and then had the pandemic radically alter the world that we had prepared for. Chaos. If I ever leave Pax Christi USA again and then return to staff, by the way, just know that the world is about to radically change again, folks. So we know that that chaos that the pandemic has unleashed here and all across the world. Over 1 million people dead, 210,000 plus here in the United States alone. People are scared about their health. They're scared about their loved ones. They're scared about their jobs and businesses. As Pat mentioned, there's rancor and division, even over simple things like wearing masks in public. And we've had an administration which has failed to mobilize to address it and failed to unite our people to face it. The incompetence and the arrogance, the gaslighting and inhumanity of this administration is like nothing I would have ever guessed coming from our federal government, whether Republican or Democrat in years past. Chaos. And then in May, as we were shut down, out of work, stuck in our homes with no sports or new movies to distract us, we watched together a video of a white police officer kneeling on the neck of a black man, George Floyd, as people off camera cried out that Mr. Floyd couldn't breathe, that he was being choked to death. Now, maybe many of us on this call already knew the stories of black men and women killed by police. Maybe we knew the statistics. Maybe we knew about how policing and incarceration had replaced Jim Crow and slavery before that to serve the white supremacy that eats away at the heart of our society like a cancer, maintaining white privilege, terrorizing communities of color into submission. But this image, caught on video at a time when we could not but help, when there was no other way than to pay attention to it, it seemed to tip the scales, to draw out people who never had to really think about what racism does to this country or how some of us benefit from it. It mobilized people, young people especially, to turn out in the streets. And the sports world, local governments, even major corporations suddenly said that they got it about racial justice. Again, sadly, the White House did not. And that tension that MLK, that Martin Luther King Jr. had talked about, that hidden tension, which so many of us never have to look at, now it wasn't so hidden away. Now people were calling it out in the light of day. And as scripture tells us, anybody with eyes to see or ears to see or ears to hear simply can't not see the racism that afflicts and disfigures all of us. And since then, there have been more killings, protests every day across this country. President Trump on national TV refusing to condemn white supremacist groups. All this too can feel like chaos. I don't think I need to paint that picture any more clearly for you. You know, wildfires and hurricanes and people who deny climate change. A president who suggests he might not leave office if he loses this election and encourages his followers to intimidate people going to the polls. The very real possibility of violence this election season was further driven home this week by the arrest of members of an armed militia who had planned on kidnapping and trying for treason the governor of Michigan. Chaos, chaos, chaos. So let's talk about resilience. One of the things that I think goes really unappreciated by many of us who count ourselves as part of the Pax Christi USA community is that we are part of a larger network, that this larger network to which we belong has a history, which is our legacy. And I'm just wondering, by a show of hands, people can just hold up their hands. Did anybody on the call join us last week for the celebration that we hosted on Zoom for the 75th anniversary of Pax Christi International? Okay, I didn't know if some folks on this call had joined us or not, but it was a really incredible experience. We, Pax Christi USA, we belong to an international movement that arose from the death and destruction of World War II, when French and German Catholics, who had slaughtered each other by the millions twice in a period of 30 years, looked at each other across borders and said, how? How can two people who share the same faith, worship the same God, claim to follow the same Jesus, how can we hate and kill one another by the millions? Bishop Pierre Théas was one of the few Catholic bishops in France to speak out against the German occupation of his country, the Vichy government that collaborated with the Nazis, and the imprisonment and extermination of the Jews. During the war, Bishop Théas pleaded with French Catholics to see their Jewish neighbors as their brothers and sisters, to protect them, to hide them. And he publicly criticized those in power who executed the policies that led to the concentration camps. For these reasons, he eventually was imprisoned. Now, when he was in prison, he took it upon himself to try and lift the morale of his fellow prisoners. He saw to their spiritual needs. He comforted them, celebrated the Mass for them. At one of these masses, Bishop Teos read from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew's Gospel, those words of Jesus about loving our enemies. And his heart leapt into his throat. He was captured by them. He asked aloud how this command could be put into practice, and he was met with extreme resistance from his co-prisoners. It's impossible, they said. They've killed our families and imprisoned us. But Teos stuck to his conviction that Jesus intended no exceptions to this command, that the command was valid no matter what the situation. When he tried to lead the men in the praying of the Our Father, they refused to say the line, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who have trespassed against us." Now, eventually, World War II was over. It came to an end, and Teos was one of the lucky ones to be released. But this struggle with how to love one's enemies stayed with him. And soon afterward, he was approached by a French laywoman, Marthe Dortel-Claudeau, who during the war had helped hide Jewish families, and viewing the devastation after World War II, had been moved in prayer to focus her own prayer on the healing of the German people, an orientation that was met by scorn and ridicule by many of her fellow French who had suffered because of the Nazis. But she persisted in this prayer, and in meeting Bishop Teos, the two of them would launch a movement, this movement to which we belong, a movement that is rooted in Jesus' command to love your enemies and to do good to those who persecute you. Resilience, hope. A few weeks ago, we offered a webinar as Pax Christi USA with one of my good friends and colleagues, former National Council chair, and she's currently on the staff at Pax Christi International, Judy Code. And Judy introduced the project that she's working on at Pax Christi International to the US audience, to many people who had not heard of it or been aware of what was happening. And that project is called the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. In 2016, at the Vatican, under the auspices of Pax Christi International and the Vatican's Justice and Peace Council, a conference was held on nonviolence and just peace. And I and all of you who are part of Pax Christi USA should take great pride in seeing how it was longtime members of Pax Christi USA, like Marie Dennis and Judy, Rosemarie Berger and others active, how they were the leaders in pulling together bishops and priests, Vatican officials, women religions, theologians and social scientists, activists, and peace practitioners from around the world with the purpose of exploring the nonviolence that is at the heart of the gospel and affirming nonviolence's centrality to Catholic identity, teaching, and practice. The conference included Pax Christi leaders from Africa who were employing nonviolence to settle ethnic and tribal conflict disputes in Kenya and elsewhere. Pax Christi leaders from the Philippines were there, and they shared how the church in the 1970s and the 80s had seeded the ground by teaching nonviolence in parishes and schools for decades, resulting in a largely nonviolent revolution that overthrew Marcos and brought democracy and respect for human rights to their country. The stories of nonviolent action in Iraq, Colombia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and elsewhere inspired the birth of this new project, the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, which imagines what the world might look like if 1 billion Catholics were committed to the power of nonviolence as a matter of faith and discipleship. And this message, the work of the initiative, is having an impact, even at the highest levels of the Vatican. Some of you might remember in 2017, that Pope Francis delivered on New Year's Day, the World Day of Peace, a message entitled Nonviolence, a Style of Politics for Peace. Pax Christi had been asked to provide input for what that message should look like. And one of the great excitements of my career is to read Pope Francis's speech, the message that he gave, and to find there about 80% of what Pax Christi USA had put forward to him to be included in that message. 80% of what we heard in that message came from the work of Pax Christi. Now, Pax Christi has often wandered on the fringes of the church, toiling while we felt like little of what we did reached beyond our own circles or impacted those at the center. But those who kept that light aflame heard their words, their ideas, their dreams, and their hopes come from the mouth of Pope Francis to the entire church that day. Resilience, hope. Now, almost 50 years ago, a small group of mainly lay Catholics here in the United States gathered together. Some of them have names that you're going to recognize, like Bishop Thomas Gumbleton, Dorothy Day, Eileen Egan, and Gordon Zahn, and a number of others. Veterans of the anti-war movement and the farm workers movement, but also the civil rights movement of the 50s and the 60s. And this small group would align their organization with Pax Christi International and give birth to Pax Christi USA in 1972. But like a lot of organizations that promoted ideals and values like peace, equality, and justice, the systemic racism in the DNA of a country founded on white privilege and to serve white supremacy also infects every institution created in that context, including Pax Christi USA. In the mid-90s, Pax Christi USA did a membership survey that unearthed this little gem. Our membership was 97.5% white. For an organization that called itself the National Catholic Peace and Justice Movement, this figure raised important questions regarding our organizational identity and who we claim to be. We were aware that there were thriving African-American Catholic communities throughout the United States, in New Orleans and Baltimore, St. Louis, Chicago, and elsewhere. We knew that the Catholic Church in the US had been growing in terms of Latinx membership for decades. Indeed, even as recently as today, people of color in the US Catholic Church outnumber white Catholics now. It was this recognition that our membership almost totally was white, and the incongruity between that and what it means to call ourselves the National Catholic Peace and Justice Movement when we were almost totally white that led to serious and rigorous self-examination. It became a transformative moment for Pax Christi USA. It was just over 20 years ago, really a matter of recent history, a single generation, that Pax Christi USA made a commitment to embrace anti-racism, to examine the systemic racism within our own organization. And we began that work with a partner, Crossroads Ministry. Our journey started in the mid-90s with anti-racism training for our national council and key people in leadership. And it led to the commitment that we made in 1999, over a generation ago. The vision that came out of that discernment led us to state this. Pax Christi USA seeks to embrace this new anti-racist identity and to do all of its work from an anti-racist perspective in the conviction that personal and systemic racism continues to perpetrate deep spiritual and social brokenness and endangers creation. And I personally am so grateful for the leadership of Pax Christi USA in that time to recognize the importance that it would involve to bring us to the questions that go to the heart of our identity when the issue is racism. And I'm grateful, especially to Nancy Small, who was leading us at that time and is on this call. This meant re-examining our history, our mission, our structures, our policies and procedures, our partnerships, our business dealings, the ways of working, and more. It meant dismantling the systemic racism that was woven throughout and reconstituting our organization with the lens of anti-racism. Now, as a Catholic worker for 15 years, I lived with and I worked alongside a lot of people who suffered from addiction. And one of the fellas whom I got to know at my first Catholic worker community was, and these are his words, not mine, an old-time alcoholic. And his name was Gary. And Gary used to tell me that for guys who were just starting their recovery, just starting to get off of alcohol or drugs, that what they needed to realize was that they didn't become an alcoholic or an addict overnight. And it wasn't going to magically go away overnight. It was going to be a long haul. And as I think about Pax Christi USA's commitment to anti-racism, I always remember that lesson. Like every organization in our country, we are not exempt or immune to being shaped to serve the white supremacy that has rightly been called our nation's original sin. We might have made the commitment to doing this work to become anti-racist 21 years ago, but it really is generational work. The steps that we have taken have been baby steps, but there have been moments along the way that test where we are on that journey. The death of George Floyd and today's Black Lives Matter movement is one such moment. It's a moment that gives the white people in our movement a chance to demonstrate that we've learned a thing or two over the past 2 decades, that we've learned what it means to be accountable to communities of color, especially those within our own church, and how to stand alongside them, be allies, and maybe most importantly, educate and challenge other white people and the church itself. In October of this past year, I attended a racial justice conference at Fontbonne University in St. Louis that was put on by the Catholic Racial Justice Collaborative. And I went especially to see again Reverend Joseph Brown, a Jesuit priest, scholar, and poet, and an African-American man. Some of you who maybe were with us in Chicago might remember him talking to us there at the national conference in either 2009 or 2010. Now at this conference, he spoke, as always, passionately about racial justice, his dissatisfaction with the racism that he witnesses in the church, its structures, and especially in the hierarchy. But he also issued a challenge that really stuck with me. He said with a heavy sigh that as a Black man, he was tired of talking about racism and racial justice, that he had been delivering the same message over and over and over again to audiences within the church, and he was tired. And it was time, he said, for white people to step up to the podium and to talk about racism, to call for racial justice, to challenge systemic racism. White people needed to step up and speak out, especially to other white people. The question of racism had to be as important to white people as it was to people of color. And it's that challenge from Father Brown that has been driving the response that Pax Christi USA has had since the death of George Floyd and the rise of Black Lives Matter. We're still an organization made up overwhelmingly of white people. Even as our demographics have changed, especially on our staff and in leadership, we're still majority white. White people in Pax Christi USA, like myself, who have been the beneficiaries of 2 decades of anti-racist training, need to pick up this work and do the work that is ours to do on racism in society, in our own organizations, in our families and communities, and especially within our churches. I think the most important work that we've done started over 20 years ago. It was all that work that happened, it was all the work that happened so that our community could be ready to respond to this moment, or the moment when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, or after the massacre at Emmanuel AME Church in South Carolina, or the events in Charlottesville, Virginia, or in response to the racist, divisive rhetoric that has dominated this administration since before this president was even elected. It's the anti-racism workshops that my immediate predecessors, Sister Patty Chappelle and Sister Anne Louise Nato of the Sisters of Notre Dame du Namur, have been doing with religious communities, youth groups, high school students, and parishes. It's the hundreds of Pax Christi USA local group leaders and members who were trained in a common analysis that links prejudice and power. It was the first ever event in the US Catholic Church, co-sponsored by Pax Christi USA, that gathered together representatives from Black, Latinx, Native American, and Asian national Catholic organizations, along with representatives from key national Catholic social justice institutions, to reflect upon the challenge of dismantling institutional racism in the church. It's been the steady drumbeat of resources on our website and through social media over the past 20 years that offer an anti-racist critique of our own work and hold up and honor the leadership of others who have been working toward racial justice in our society and with whom we have often partnered. We've been curating and generating the best of what is out there for our membership to pray, study, and act in support of Black Lives Matter. And we do it with an eye for what it means for us as Catholics, for the church. That's our intersection point. Black Lives Matter and our faith. Pax Christi local groups all across the US show up for Black Lives Matter marches. We recognize the leadership of our sisters and brothers of color who have been doing this work for a long time within our movement and outside of it, and we take our cue from them, showing up when asked to show up, speaking out when asked to speak out, sharing resources, promoting actions, mobilizing to support advocacy actions, educating our own people, and making sure that racial justice is at the top of the issues that are at stake in this election. Make no mistake, the steps we've taken have been baby steps. But this moment today gives the white people in our movement a chance to demonstrate what we've learned these past 2 decades. And the people of color within our movement, they are watching to see how true to our word white sisters and brothers are, and whether we will join them now, listen, show up, follow, and help make this the tipping point for real change in our nation, so that all of us can one day look back at this time and say, yes, it was then that everything changed. Resilience and hope. So one last thing. I've been thinking a lot about the fact that Pax Christi USA is going to be 50 years old in 2022. Pax Christi USA has been a big part of my adult life. As you heard Brian say, I've been with Pax Christi 30 years and I'm 52. So that tells you that I've kind of grown up in Pax Christi USA. Joe Nangle, who's from the Boston area, I think, he's a Franciscan, a PC USA Ambassador of Peace. And I lived with Joe at DC, and he was my first introduction to Pax Christi USA through his column in Sojourners Magazine, which was a gift that I was given when I was doing a year of volunteer service right after college, working with homeless people. It was that same year that I went to my first Pax Christi Florida retreat, where I spent time devouring Dan Berrigan's stories and biblical insights. My 20s were spent organizing retreats and gatherings for students and young adults all over the nation under the Pax Christi USA umbrella, leading a local group at the University of Florida where I was a campus minister, serving on the Florida State Council, eventually joining the national staff, and after that, even working in Brussels for Pax Christi International. So, I think this 50th anniversary of the founding of Pax Christi USA is a pretty big deal, and I'm hoping that as a movement, it provides a year of reflection for us. What has been our legacy? What have been our victories and challenges? Part of the title of our talk today is Pax Christi Engage. What have we learned from that engagement, from our promotion and practice of gospel nonviolence? What has been our story? But I also think that it can be a moment of rebirth for us too, a jubilee year in the biblical vernacular, where we get to take all that we've done and been and let it shape who we will be for the next 50 years. Pax Christi USA has had the flexibility to change and adapt as the world has changed, embracing a variety of issues and shaping our identity to faithfully bring the message of the gospel to bear on what was happening in the world by reading the signs of the times. That group that founded Pax Christi in the 70s, Pax Christi USA looked very differently when faced with the issues of the 80s. It looked even more differently when the Cold War was over and we had to pivot and figure out who we were in an axis that went from war and peace and east and west to oppression and liberation and north and south. We've always been flexible. We've always held at our heart the gospel, our commitment to nonviolence. This is who we are. Pax Christi USA has been a movement, but it's also a community. For many of you, as it is for me, Pax Christi USA is my church. It's the place where I pray, study, and act. It's where I hear the word of God and where I break bread with other disciples, sharing in and celebrating the Eucharist. It is still my Sunday school, my religious education, where I'm challenged to grow more deeply in Christ and live out my commitment to Jesus. I have heard these same sentiments expressed by members all over the country. That's where our strength lies, that we are the church, the community of disciples that traces our lineage back to that first group of women and men who gathered around Jesus when he walked amongst us and tried to embody who he was and what he stood for. This is why I believe that our greatest strength is in our grassroots. It's in our network of local groups and religious communities, high school and campus chapters, parishes, regions, individual members who are all striving to be the Christ of peace in the world today. Like the biblical image of yeast and dough, we have a responsibility to grow that network, to give birth to Pax Christi local communities so that they are like leaven in every parish, in every diocese, at every Catholic university and high school, and in cities and towns and states across our nation. So as we approach 50 years, how do we do this for the next 50 years? How do those first and second generations who founded and shaped this movement pass that legacy on to the next generation of leaders? These are the conversations that I hope we'll have together as we move toward 50 and start the next 50. So in closing, yes, it's a time of chaos, but we are a resilient people, and we have always been shaped by the hope that is born of the resurrection of a God who is stronger than death. Our resilience comes from sharing the gospel DNA of all those who have gone before
Okay,
us.
it's working. Want to come over? I have a chair. Oh, wait a sec. Did it just freeze again?
Somebody's unmuted themselves there. I think thank you. Great. So again, we've been shaped by that hope that is born of the resurrection of a God who is stronger than death. Our resilience comes from sharing the gospel DNA of all those who have gone before us in this movement, that cloud of witnesses who embody Jesus for us. Our hope, I think, is rooted in the soil of these first 50 years of striving to be the peace of Christ in the world. And I feel that hope still growing outward, reaching out toward the sun, budding with new growth and new life for these next 50 years. Thanks, y'all. And I'm looking forward to having a little conversation and answering some questions here.
Thank you, Johnny. That's makes me so happy to be part of this movement and really gets me excited and hopeful and wonderful. So as I think I said at the beginning, if you want to ask a question, just kind of open your chat, select me, Brian Neshmankis, and send some questions. If I get a few at a time that are similar, I'll kind of maybe mix them together, but otherwise I'll just ask them. I do have one already, but I'll give people maybe a few moments to just think through and if there's anything you want to ask, but no rush either. You can keep them coming as we're answering. Okay, so like I said, feel free to keep the questions coming. But the first one comes in from Mike, and he wants to know, Johnny, what signs of progress do you see in the U.S. Catholic Church, especially in regards to becoming an anti-racist institution?
That's a good question, Mike. And yeah, what signs of progress do I see? I think some of y'all know that the U.S. bishops put out a letter on racism. I guess it's a couple years now, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And Pax Christi USA had responded to the letter that the USCCB put out, really very critical of the letter. One of the things that we heard, and one of the things I heard from Father Joe Brown when I went and heard him talk last October, was that the tone of that letter from the U.S. Catholic bishops, it was a sort of us and them letter. It was acting as if we, the U.S. bishops, are the church, and we welcome you, people of color who are part of the church, as being part of us, rather than acknowledging that the church is all of us, that the church isn't an us and them, but it's an all of us thing, that very much people of color felt spoken to, in that document, rather than it being a document that sort of embraced the identity that the church is all of us together. So Pax Christi USA has been really, I think, very sensitive within the parishes that we're a part of, within the local groups that we have, to recognizing that our strength as a church is that we are a church of a wide variety of people, that there's a diversity to the Catholic Church that adds to its richness, that it's the experience of people, especially people who know firsthand the legacy of oppression and racism, that informs who we are. That it's the people of color within the Catholic Church who can connect most easily to that original, community of Scripture, the slaves in Egypt, who under the Pharaoh, that can take up that story, that embody that story, that have something to teach the rest of us. I think that what we have seen is we've seen some. Again, it's hard for me to talk about the progress because I don't think there's enough progress, to be honest. I think there needs to be a lot more. We don't hear it being preached out from, I live here in St. Louis, which is a church, which the church in St. Louis has a large African-American community. And yet racial justice is so very, it's so rare to hear anything about racial justice from the pulpit. It's so rare to hear it lifted up as an issue within political dialogue. It's so rare for us to hear how it is that our country's immigration policies are on par with issues that have to do with the so-called pro-life movement in our country. I think that the institutional church, frankly, Mike, has a long way to go in terms of progress on the issues, especially the issues of racial justice in our country. Sorry, I'm not more hopeful there. I know that at the grassroots level, there is good stuff happening. We see, like we saw with the civil rights movement, we see collars and we see women religious. Women religious are always on the front lines of every important issue that's affecting us as a nation. And we see women religious out there as part of Black Lives Matters protests. We see people like the folks like you guys on this call who have supported, whether it's been with donations or whether it's been with electronic advocacy or whether it's been with, safe, social distanced protests. The work that's been happening around racial justice since the death of George Floyd. So I think that there is progress being made. I think that it's happening more organically, and it's certainly not happening from the top down, but from the bottom up.
Yeah. Wow. And our second question's from Sam. She says, what do you think is driving the great upheaval and chaos of racism, systemic violence, and government disorder? And why this upheaval now?
I think a couple things driving it. One, it's not like it's something new. It's something that we've got a legacy that goes back at least 400, 500 years in our country. And in many ways, in some sense, I think people want to think of the civil rights movement of the 60s as having been the thing that solved racism in the country, in the United States. And we know that that's not true. We look at our policies around policing. We look at our policies around incarceration. We look at the disparities in terms of education and healthcare, who it is that dies from COVID-19 in this country and who doesn't. And we know that racism continues, to afflict us. It continues to terrorize and humiliate communities of color, and it continues to benefit, those of us who benefit from white privilege. So I think what's driving the upheaval right now is a couple things. One is I do think that it was a sort of a perfect storm of what happened to George Floyd in May. it was a time when our country was shut down and when there wasn't a whole lot going on. And people who otherwise would have been watching the NBA playoffs or watching the first month of the baseball season or going out to see the new blockbuster movies that were being released, that they were at home and they had to watch this video and they had to see with their own eyes something that they couldn't distract themselves from, that they couldn't overlook, that they couldn't somehow miss. It was there everywhere for people to see, people who might have found a way to distract themselves from it before. And so because of the pandemic, we were shut down and we had to pay attention. And it was that attention to George Floyd coupled with the sort of, overt dog whistle style racism that is coming out of the current White House, the tacit or explicit approval of extremism, of white power extremism from the highest levels of government, a creation of space that we saw first in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2016 or 2017, that where the racism that had been sort of pushed down and more covertly was allowed a space in our public conversations again, that it was allowed to sort of flower in the light of day, and it was given that space by our leadership, by people like President Trump, frankly. So I think all of that contributes to it. But I think maybe what most contributes or what's most important is that we're not just talking about the kind of overt racism that so many people associate with what we were combating with the civil rights movement, but it's been the move to understand systemic racism, how it is that systemic issues affect communities of color, and how it is that systemic issues uplift people who are white. The disparities that we've talked about in terms of education and healthcare. And that's another thing, again, with the pandemic, we've seen how it is that communities of color and indigenous communities are bearing the brunt, a greater brunt of the deaths and the illnesses from COVID-19 than our white communities are. We know about the disparity of resources in terms of poverty and housing and other things like that. But it's been a conversation, I think, and I'm really proud that Pax Christi USA, I think, has contributed to that conversation because, like I said in the talk, for a generation, we've been having a conversation about what it means to be anti-racist, which is more than being concerned about the issue of racism. It's about examining white privilege. It's about looking at systemic racism. And so over this last generation, like within Pax Christi USA, but other organizations as well, Pax Christi USA was one of the first in the Catholic Church to bring up this conversation, again, over a generation ago, but other people have started having it as well, is that the field was seeded for this conversation so that when George Floyd happened, when George Floyd was murdered, the country had a critical mass of people that knew the language of anti-racism and could talk about systemic racism. So it's that tension that has been there for generations that was brought out by the on-camera death of George Floyd and which people, I think, are responding to out of their experience of being trained in this work, of being conversant in it over the last generation.
Questions are really coming in now. And the next one's actually from Sister Jane. And she hopes you don't feel on the spot with this, but she cherishes an image you gave her years ago about with hopefully you understand the fireflies against a black velvet sky.
Yeah. Yep.
So she wants you to reflect on that as especially as you might today.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful image. And I guess one of the ways that I would reflect on that today is it's in some ways it's related to that biblical story that I referenced about being like leaven and dough, that there is a sense again, the power of Pax Christi USA is a people power. And even though we are not the majority, even though we don't have the kind of membership, that numbers in the hundreds of thousands or the millions, it is each of us, holding individual candles like fireflies against that dark sky, against that black velvet sky, that we're keeping that light alive. And it's a light that allows the rest of us to see. And it's a light also that allows us to identify one another. Like fireflies, we're sending out signals to one another that we're here, we're holding the light for one another, and that we're in solidarity with each other. So I think it's a beautiful image in that way. And it talks to the importance, again, in a time like this, of chaos and division and rancor, to how we keep that light alive and how we signal one another that the light is still alive and that we aren't alone. We are together, even if we're apart from one another, even if the darkness seeks to overwhelm us at any moment. Thanks, Sister Jane. That was really nice to hear.
And let's see, and then we have Martha Dowd, who asks, would you, or do you think that part of Pax Christi's mission would be to challenge the Christian right and the lack of empathy, their lack of empathy for the disempowered?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, honestly, I think our first audience as Catholics, as the National Catholic Peace and Justice Movement, is to critique our own church. And I include the Catholic right or the Catholic conservative in that term, Christian right. So yeah, I absolutely think that we're called to be critical of that, to embody something different, to prophetically call it out as unchristian, as not in line with what we see with Jesus. You know, one of the things that Pax Christi USA did that I was really proud of, and you guys might remember this, is, you know, when Trump had the protesters cleared in front of the White House to go and have his photo op in front of the Episcopal Church down the street from the White House and hold that Bible up very awkwardly, as only somebody who's never held a Bible before might hold it. You know, the very next day, John Paul II Shrine in Washington, D.C. had invited Trump and his wife to come to the shrine. Again, what amounted to another publicity stunt the very day after that stunt there. And we heard about that. I was on Twitter at midnight the night before when the Trump administration released their agenda for the next day. And the reason they're releasing it at 1 o'clock in the morning Eastern time is so that people don't see what they're going to do the next day, that people are asleep, that they're not paying attention. But one of our members, a young woman, Adrienne Alexander from Chicago, who used to be on our board, tweeted at me and said, "Johnny, did you see this? He's going to the John Paul II Shrine tomorrow. You know, can we get people out there to stand in protest of that? To say that the policies and the rhetoric that this administration holds up and which plays so well to the Christian right is not the kind of message that we associate with Jesus, and that we won't allow our church and our shrines and our faith to be co-opted for public, as a public relations, marketing ploy." And so even though it was 1 o'clock in the morning Eastern time, we started to mobilize with people, and Judy Code and Susan Gunn from Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns were able to turn out people on the ground. And I think it ended up being like 300 people were out there lining the streets leading to the shrine to make sure that this didn't go unnoticed, that he couldn't just waltz into the shrine and take a nice couple photos, use those to talk about how great he is for Catholics and how he's upholding Catholic values and whatnot as sort of an election stunt. So I feel like that's one of the ways that we're pushing back, that we were able to take an instant that the Christian right could latch onto and say, this is our president. This is what it means to be a strong leader and to stand for freedom of religion and whatnot. And we were able to prophetically get out in the streets and make sure that we said, no, this is not who we are. This is not what Jesus stands for. And this isn't this isn't what it means to be a Christian in the United States today.
Yeah, I remember when you did that last minute work to get that mobilized, Johnny. The next one's actually from Father Rocco. I really like this question, but I think I'm biased. He says, one challenge we face in Pax Christi, Massachusetts especially, is our attempt to engage young people and college youth, and he wants to know if you have any suggestions to capture their enthusiasm and sustain it, to invite them to be part of us.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And again, as I mentioned, my entry point to Pax Christi USA was as a young person. And one of the things that I really benefited from, and I think that we have a richness to offer young people, is the experience of being supported and mentored. that there are young people that are trying to find their place within the church, that there are young people who are motivated to try to live lives of deep discipleship to Jesus, that they want to take seriously the words of Jesus, and they want to go out and sell everything they have and live as if they were poor for a little while and figure out, what it means to follow Jesus at its most deepest level. And for me, Pax Christi USA was the context for being able to work out those questions of discipleship. So one of the things that we're prioritizing at the national office is that we're strategizing for how to give young people in our movement more space to be who they are, to address the issues that mean something to them, to have the resources that they need to undertake their own projects, and to be able to make decisions for themselves and the movement about who we are and what we stand for. It's this question of space, I think, because, I loved my grandparents when I was 25 years old, but I really didn't want to be part of a local prayer group with them. There was different and stuff. There were things we could do together and stuff, but I wanted to have my own space with people who were my peers. And so what Pax Christi USA did for people like me when I was part of it in Florida was they carved out those spaces. They liberated spaces where young people could gather. They helped to support us. They helped to make sure that there weren't obstacles to young people being able to gather together. And then they built bridges so that the young people, the young cohorts within Pax Christi, the young cohort within Pax Christi could work together and could be shaped and mentored and formed by our elders within the movement. So again, that's my story in Pax Christi. I was mentored by elder members of this movement, including some of the people in this room. And I stayed because first Pax Christi Florida and then Pax Christi USA gave me and my cohort the space to do our thing. They gave us the space to set our own agenda. They gave us the space to be able to address it and how to do it. And they gave us the resources needed to figure it out, partially on our own, but with guidance when asked for. The Pax Christi USA umbrella was extended to include us, to give us the space to learn how to be leaders and to make our own mistakes, to own our decisions, to invest our own time and energy and selves in projects of our own creation. And I think young people need that same space now. We need to extend them our trust and our resources. We need to let them experiment with doing things in ways that make sense to them. And we need to celebrate how they will change our movement, even if it becomes different than what we once needed it to be as older people within this movement. Eileen Egan's Pax Christi USA was not the Pax Christi USA of the late 80s. And the Pax Christi USA that existed prior to the end of the Cold War was very different than the one that existed after. So change is the nature of things. And I think there's great variation in being the peace of Christ in the world. And we need to hold our own agenda loosely enough that we can allow young people to do and say and be the way that they're going to be in Pax Christi USA without asking them to do it or be the way that we are in Pax Christi USA, if that makes sense.
Okay. So I think we now have more questions than minutes left. So I'm going to try to merge a few together, and if you can just give something quick about I can get as much of this in as possible. I see two questions kind of about our response to Trump, so I think I'll ask both those kind of together. One is about if we're involved in any of the work to have a nonviolent response in case Trump refuses to leave, and if he and then there's another one about from Pat about I don't know if that was from Pat. From Jim Robinson about how we resist the illusion that Trump is pro-life. But maybe just quickly about those two kind of aspects, and I'll try to move on to others.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just try to briefly answer that. Is one of the things is, yes, we are, I think the Pax Christi USA local groups in particular are mobilizing to be active in their communities, both to protect the voting rights that people have in their community, but also to be ready for the long haul that comes out after this election if things are not understood to be clear on election day, for the process that happens afterwards. And I'll point you to a couple places. One is that one member of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, a member of Pax Christi USA, Rosemarie Berger at Sojourners Magazine. Sojourners has put out a really good piece in their latest issue, and it's on their website, about strategizing for after the election and what the response is in terms of election, the possibility of election violence, the possibility that there will be disputes and stuff. And I think that's a great piece to read, and it really reflects the values that we hold as Pax Christi USA. And I'm so pleased to recommend it because of Rose's work, within Pax Christi USA, and I know how deeply involved she's been in putting Sojourners at the forefront of this. The other thing is that quite a few of groups that Pax Christi is associated with, like the Meta Peace Team out of Michigan, like the DC Peace Team, are putting together trainings for people that want to be ready to be mobilized and have a nonviolent presence on the ground when, in light of what might happen after the election. And I think the website is dcpeaceteam.org, but I'm not sure that they've got trainings coming up, and we'll put some of those trainings up on our website too, on our elections page. If you haven't visited the Pax Christi USA website, I'd encourage you to do that and to check out the elections page there. And there is where I think too you can find this pushback to this idea that Trump is pro-life. Again, our own bishop president, we should be so proud to have Bishop John Stowe as our bishop president. He was quoted a few weeks back in NCR, but it got picked up by the New York Times and the Miami Herald, and went pretty wide, where he said, there can be no other, there can be no misunderstanding that our current president is anti-life. If you look at all of the things that make up the policies of the Trump administration, to confuse that, to somehow turn that into a pro-life agenda, is to ignore the evidence at every turn. So I think that for people who, for them, the only issue is abortion, and the only issue is overturning Roe v. Wade, and the only issue is putting conservative judges on the Supreme Court, for them, Trump is pro-life. For anybody who has any interest in any other issue besides that, it is clear that this president is not remotely pro-life. And one of the things that we put out in our statement of principles, which are all rooted in Catholic social teaching, which are rooted in the teaching of the church and in our understanding of who Jesus is and what Jesus stood for, those statement of principles reflect what it means to really stand for human dignity in the world today. And it's clear from anybody who reads that this current administration, whether the issue is immigration or the death penalty, whether the issue is racism or the care of or the treatment of the pandemic, is not a pro-life administration.
There's actually a request if you want to use mention an article, if you can put that name of that article in the chat.
Yeah, I will look. I will see if I can find it really quickly. And
not to heavy multitask here, but think about there's a good question here about, has there been any thought given to inviting other Christian communities to join Pax Christi's effort to promote world peace and establish racial justice and equity?
Give me just a second here, Brian. I'm sorry. I'm just going to post it in the chat. So the article it's on Sojourner's website. It's called "In the Event of a Tainted Election, the Faith Community Must Rise Up." And it says faithful citizenship sometimes requires that we withdraw our consent and cooperation. And I will put the link to that article in the chat. There it is. All right, go ahead, Brian.
Okay, so has there been any thought given to inviting other Christian communities to join Pax Christi's effort to promote world peace and establish racial justice and equity?
Yeah, again, there can be no siloing of the work for peace and justice in the world. And Pax Christi USA, the strength of our movement is only as strong as the strength of our partnerships and the coalitions that we're part of. So we work in a couple different networks. We've been part of anti-war networks like Win Without War. We are part of networks like the DC Catholic Coalition, which brings together all of the Catholic organizations like Network and Leadership Conference for Women Religious, and the Columbans, and the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns, and the Jesuit Conference, that we come together with all of them to work on issues, in common and together. We're part of a combination of groups that do advocacy around a whole range of issues. Important for me, and this is something that we haven't done a whole lot of here my first year, but it was something that was really important in the wake of 9/11, and which we need to strengthen again, is our relationships across faith lines, our relationships with the Muslim community and with the Jewish community, as well as other Christian denominations here in the United States, that we need to strengthen those, and we need to build and be part of a movement that recognizes the commonality of our common humanity, and that we all, as human beings, that's what Jesus showed us. Is Jesus didn't show us how to be Catholic or to be Christian. He showed us how to be human. So that's what binds us together. And we need to reach out, no matter what people's faith is, to work in a concerted effort so that we're all pulling in the same direction. Because there's a great song, some of y'all might know John Fromer, who died a few years ago, but John had a song, it was called Gonna Take Us All. It's going to take us all to make a change. It's going to take us all, to bring the peace and justice that we long for in this world. So yeah, we've got to be working across whatever artificial boundaries we set up in terms of religion and race and creed and politics.
I think I can merge a couple of the other thoughts here into one last question here. I think in general, there's a question about, we have this great news that, that Pope Francis basically indicated that just war theory is no longer valid in his latest thing. And so how does that apply, though, first of all, in one of the questions, to kind of our national situation where, we have where gun rights and militarism are so integral into our society, and then taking it even a level beyond that, lower than that, to our individual lives. How do we apply that to our lives? And I'll let you wrap up with that question then.
Yeah, no, again, if you haven't had a chance to check out the new encyclical Fratelli Tutti, it's got some incredible things in it. And one of those is, again, and I would say that there is, just war theorists are going to dispute that the just war theory has been thrown to the waste bin in Fratelli Tutti, but certainly I think you can take, in many ways, I think the way that we've talked about just war theory within Pax Christi USA is really helpful if we talk about it in the same way we talk about the death penalty, and the way that Pope Francis has talked about an evolution of the death penalty, that there may have been a time when the church, held it, but the evolution of the death penalty recognizes that it is no longer, applicable, viable in the current context in which we find ourselves. And in essence, that's what he's saying in Fratelli Tutti about the just war theory, is that there's been an evolution to such a point that no longer can just war principles be used within the context we find ourselves in to advocate for going to war. So I think that the implications of that really speak to what our core charism is as Pax Christi USA. And it's the work that I talked about with the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, is that nonviolence deserves, that it needs to be at the central to Catholic identity, thought, and practice. And that it's going to take a concerted effort, not just from peace movement folks, but from folks that are doing sacramental work, from preaching, from religious education, all of those things, that nonviolence has to start to become a central, central to the identity of what it means to be Catholic. And I think that that's really inspiring when you think about that. And I love how the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative puts it, that what kind of change would take place in the world if the Catholic Church embraced nonviolence as its central charism, as central to the work and the practice and the person of Jesus? That would be like a tipping point that would have implications far beyond the Catholic Church itself. What if we put our resources, our money, our schools, our parishes, all of the diplomatic infrastructure that the Vatican has at the service of nonviolence in the world today? What kind of difference would that make? It would be really extraordinary. And so I think one of the things that we're seeing with Pope Francis is he's pushing the church in that direction. And obviously, we're seeing that there's pushback within the church in that direction as well, too. So it's not just the work of Pope Francis. It's got to be the work of us on the ground. It's got to be the work of us who are part still of parishes, of educational institutions, that we need to make it a part of whatever the mission and ministry is that we're a part of.
So speaking of bringing that mission into parishes and other communities, I'm going to hand it over to Pat now for the Peacemaker Award.
Thanks so much, everybody. I really just want to say a word of thanks and gratitude for all of you. It is just so inspiring to me to see your faces. And to me, this is what it means to be Pax Christi. It means to come together in community like this. And again, I wish I was there physically with you, but it's nice just to be able to see you across the miles as well. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Johnny. Another time we'll get you back, maybe after you've been seasoned a bit more even in a couple of years or something. But this is going to be a fairly spontaneous, I've got lots of notes here about the Peacemaker Award, and so much of what you've said just resonates and comes home to me when I think of the fact that this year we are going to give our Peacemaker Award to Father Steve Gisoma, who is actually the parish priest of the St. Susanna Church, where my husband and I belong, and we have belonged there for about 15 years. And just to give a little background, because the story is kind of interesting. When we arrived there, the first thing that we were taken with was the fact that Steve, for the Sunday masses, always memorizes the gospel. So he comes right out in our midst and presents the reading for the day. So you're there, you're living the gospel message, and you're feeling the effects of it right at that moment. But his warmth, his generosity, his invitational quality is just unmatchable. Our parish is a welcoming parish. So anyhow, we came, and after a while, I kind of agitated and said, well, what about, peace and justice, whatever, So he said, well, why don't you start a group? So we started a group. And I mention that because from the very beginning, I do call him Steve, and he does answer to that name, but Father Steve was open and totally engaged with the process. Little did I know that he already had a history of being interested in the Catholic worker. We were already at Pax Christi Parish, and he had been a conscientious objector. So God put us there for a reason, perhaps, and we have come to know and appreciate Steve as a friend, as a mentor, as a spiritual guide. And we have been able, because of his presence there as his pastorship, to grow the local Pax Christi group. And he is part of it. Where the meetings are held there at the parish hall, we've done wonderful things. I think we are trying. He is certainly 11 in terms of talking about the essential nonviolence. I remember when I first learned of the nonviolence, it was like a secret word. No one was really talking about it, but now it's out there, and we do have it, as I would say, as a kind of charism in the parish, because it's not ignored. And there are signs in our Peace Chapel and throughout all of the efforts that we put forth. And I won't go into them, but everything is supported by Steve. He pushes back against the institution where it's necessary. He always brings us back to gospel principles. He's loving. And as I said, invitational. We have, I don't know how many zip codes represented in our parish, because people want to be there because of him, because of the programs, because of what we're trying to do. So I feel so very grateful that we've had our little experiment in bringing Pax Christi alive, and people know about it who didn't before and are participatory. We have a great local group, and everyone is willing to work, and we until our leaven runs out because of age or whatever, we will continue the pursuit with Father Steve as our gifted, loving, generous leader. So, Steve, do you have a couple of words to say?
Sure. It's really it's really humbling to be considered for that type of recognition, but I would have to honestly say that recognition needs to be focused in the Pax Christi group itself. It's for 19 years. I think for maybe 15 to 19 years now. It's been a true leaven in our parish. I think this past week that Richard Rohr made a distinction between hard prophecy and soft prophecy. And hard prophecy was the prophecy that sometimes gets the attention out in the world. It's the movements or the protests or the advocacy, but he put the true work of it in the soft prophecy of the people who really embody that from a day-to-day point of view. And it seems as if everyone in this particular parish group is just remarkable in the way that they embody that. They embody a hope, they embody a perseverance, a persistence, a joy, a tremendous faith. And they've really, I'd say that they've taught me one remarkable lesson over the years. And there's one word in this phrase that I don't really want to use, but that gospel trumps church. Something that I think we often forget. And the heart of the gospel is nonviolence, and these people have personified that in their own lives. They have really made that real in their own lives. It reminded me that when we were ordained deacons, we were sent out to preach the gospel. We weren't, as we were handed the book of the Gospels to preach, we weren't handed a catechism. And it seems as if all too often our focus is on church and supporting the idea of the church or the symbol of the church or the work of the church. That's really secondary to the work of the gospel. And these women and men on the committee have really embodied that. And it's just been a remarkable journey that is in so many ways just beginning. I think as far as we come, we have umpteen years ahead, and we have many miles to go before we sleep. So I'd really like to acknowledge the Pax Christi group here at St. Susanna's as what makes this anywhere near possible today, and to thank each and every one of them.
We can raise our hands with a clap, and thank you, Steve. We're so glad that you're there for us, and you are indeed a peacemaker. So, and your citation will be forthcoming, and we have your banner will be added to all the other banners of the peacemakers that have preceded you, and you are in very good company. So I guess I'm still on to at this point in time. The formal part of the meeting is concluded, but if you can bear with us, we will go through a very short business meeting, which is always incorporated into the assembly. So I'm speaking. So usually what happens is people like Charles Gabron give an update, for instance, on the treasurer's report, and usually we start with Jean Allen, who is our secretary, to give the report, but she couldn't be here. So it's just a very basic overview of the past year. And the past year, of course, was interrupted with we had an assembly last year on the climate crisis with Father Emmett Farrell from San Diego. Okay, and then our regular meeting, we have had 4 meetings of the board. Actually, 2 of them, because of COVID, have had to be Zoom meetings. We've produced 2 newsletters under the guidance of Mike Moran, who does a fabulous job putting everything together. And so we thank Mike and the many contributors to the newsletters. We have 14 groups in Massachusetts under our region. Some are more active than others. Some check in better than others, but they still are listed on the back of our newsletter when it comes out. We also have a uniquely, I believe, we have a prison group, Our Lady of Guadalupe at MCI Shirley Prison, that is guided by the Stanleys, who are Pax Christi members, and they run their own show there, and people can be present when that's possible. Let's see. We seek to collaborate with other groups seeking peace within the Catholic community and beyond. For instance, one of the things that we've collaborated with for years and years are the annual Stations of the Cross in front of the state capitol, which was initiated originally by Agape. And this year, people from various peace communities, Agape, the House of Peace, Sisters of St. Anne's, Spirit of Life community, and the Catholic Worker, St. Francis and Therese Catholic Worker in Worcester, members wrote stations, and we actually performed them live, read them live from St. Susanna's live, and then they were posted on our website. So right at this present time, we are working on with the hope that we will be able to engage more specifically with other faith and secular peace communities to share the benefits of what we have learned and the actions that we've taken over the years. And so we're working on that as a subcommittee. I think that kind of covers what we're doing, and we're an aging group, so we're hanging in there. We wish it was otherwise, but right now Brian is our, we cling to Brian because he's our representative from the youth corps. And I hope that maybe he can bring in more people too. So the next thing would be the treasurer's report. Charles would give that, and then just another little bit, and we'll be on our way. So Charles?
Yes, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
I want to make sure I'm on. Great. My name is Charles Gabron, and for the past 5 years, I have been the treasurer of Pax Christi, Massachusetts. We presently have two accounts, a savings account of $8,303.87, which allows our organization to have some stability financially. We also have a checking account of $2,350.48, which fluctuates depending on our expenses. Each year, we try to spend all the funds we take in on the activities related to our mission, promoting Catholic social teaching, as Pat so eloquently outlined for you. The past 2 years, I was pleased to file our report with the IRS. If anyone can ever be pleased with an IRS report, we actually were very fortunate, because in 2018, the difference between the amount we took in and the amount we spent was $24. In 2019, it was $69. In 2020, we project we will experience a modest loss of slightly over $1,000, which is far less than what most organizations and obviously most families have experienced during this pandemic. So we are financially solvent. I was very touched by so much of Johnny's talk and his words about allowing young people to have their own space and to thrive in their own way. And they were most appropriate for me as a treasurer when I think of the directions of how we want to spend our money. We've also been so delighted to be reaching out to other groups and hope to have a statewide conference coming up involving many groups. It's been a pleasure to be Pax Christi treasurer, and this ends my financial report. Thank you.
Okay, and I might just mention that one of the things Pax Christi Massachusetts does is give grants to local Pax Christi groups who of up to $250 for special programs that they might want to present and can't afford to do. So that's another thing. That's a word out there for anyone who has an idea that they want to promulgate. Okay. Yes?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, okay. And this year, usually we sort of vote on the new members or affirm the old members of the board who are staying on. Everyone is staying on, and I would just like to give their names and affirm that they are the continuing board. And of course, we always invite other people if one was interested in joining. So I and Father Rocco are still the co-coordinators, and there's Charles, who just spoke, Nancy Carapezza, Phil Herrick, Jean Allen, Brian Ashmankis, Rose Morrissey, Mike Moran, Sister Linda Bessam, and Sally Markey. So good and faithful people. We have wonderful meetings, and there's a lot of joy that we share, as well as the work that we do. And I'm grateful for all of them. Finally, we will have concluding remarks by Father Rocco and a closing prayer by Samantha Lushner. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, of the Agape community. So when Father Rocco concludes, Sam, you can speak up and do our concluding prayer. And we're very grateful for your attendance, and we look forward to, well, we hope that we will have a spring retreat, and if not that, hopefully a fall assembly. Thank you, Johnny, so much. Rocco?
Right. I too want to thank Johnny for being with us. It was great. I'm sorry we couldn't do it in person, but there will be a time for that. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. I don't have a lot to say because of time. We're a little over time, but that's okay. What I would like to encourage people to do is, if they have a chance to look at that new encyclical, I'm trying to read through it myself, and I'm greatly impressed. I think it'll affirm a lot of what we do. But I just want to share one little insight that I got that I never had before. When he was talking about the, and he has a whole Lectio Divina in chapter 2, using the scriptures as a grounding, as Jesuits usually do. I think he made a distinction between being neighbor to one another and really being brother and sister to one another. Sometimes neighbors don't get along, and we see that in our world. So the Samaritan was not a neighbor to the fellow in the pit. He was actually a challenge, and I wouldn't say an enemy, but they certainly weren't brothers. But what he did was really a fraternal act and a brotherly act. And I think all throughout the encyclical, that's what he's going to be asking us to do. And it's really going to be a challenge for us. So again, it just came out, I know, on the Pax Christi national website, which Johnny has put up in the chat. There are 2 reflections, one from an international Pax Christi and one from Joe Nangle, on how that encyclical would impact us as Pax Christi. So check out paxchristiusa.org if you're not already part of that. And again, in concluding, I'd like to again thank Johnny for being with us, as well as Lauren. It was great to have you there. And congratulations, Steve. And thank you to everyone.
And also, I failed to mention that please, if you're not a member of Pax Christi, what you do is you join Pax Christi USA, and then you are automatically connected with Pax Christi Massachusetts. We have no dues, so you would belong to us if you join Pax Christi USA. Please do that. That's a very important way of supporting the efforts.
And let me make one last comment. Both Charles and Pat talked about this upcoming statewide meeting. There's a subcommittee of the board that has been working on reaching out to all of the peace groups, Catholic or not, inviting them to hopefully a planning meeting that we're going to have in January that will then construct a statewide meeting with all the different groups that want to participate on nonviolence, on nuclear disarmament. Originally, we wanted to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Peace Pastoral, but when we looked at it, we saw that it was great for its time, but we need more. So we've taken it out of the 40th anniversary of the Peace Pastoral to something more regarding nonviolence and nuclear disarmament. So keep abreast with that. We'll have stuff on the website, but that's what we're working on. Back to you, Pat.
No, back to Sam for the concluding prayer.
Yeah, thank you, Pat and Johnny and everyone. So we come together now, sisters and brothers, with our hearts filled with hope and love, reminded that love knows no limits, no bounds, and it is this true love that is in each of us. May this true love continue to exist in us, and may we see it in one another. We conclude with a poem by Thich Nhat Hanh titled Our True Heritage. The cosmos is filled with precious gems. I want to offer a handful of them to you this afternoon. Each moment you are alive is a gem, shining through and containing earth and sky, water and clouds. It needs you to breathe gently for the miracles to be displayed. Suddenly you hear the birds singing, the pines chanting, see the flowers blooming, the blue.
Oh, she froze.
You, the richest person on earth, who have been going around and begging for a living, stop being the destitute child. Come back and claim your heritage. We should enjoy our happiness and offer it to everyone. Cherish this very moment. Let go of the stream of distress and embrace life fully in your arms. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.